One of the very best parts of TwainFest is the author's Salon, an opportunity for folks to meet some of the distinguished literary figures of the 19th century. Today, we have Mr. Charles Dickens. Though I never had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Dickens personally, he does play a very important role in my life history. As a young author and gadabout town, I had the distinct pleasure of asking Miss Olivia Langdon to the theater. Her father granted her permission, and we went on our first engagement together. She later became my bride. At the theater, Mr. Dickens was performing, and it was my job as a reporter for one of the New York papers to cover that enterprise. I spent so much of the evening entertaining Miss Langdon that I must honestly tell you, though I published a perfectly serviceable review in the papers, I do not and did not recall a single word that Mr. Dickens uttered from that stage. Let's see what he has to say, shall we?
I'd like to thank you for stopping by today as we talk about some of my background. Now, although I'm quite sometimes referred to as Dickens of London, I was not born in London at all. I was born in a small seaside town named Portsmouth. Now, why would I be born in Portsmouth of all places? Now, it's not just because my mum was there. It's actually because my father, John Dickens, was employed by the Royal Navy. Now, during this time of exploration for Her Royal Majesty's Navy, my father was very popular in the Navy about once a month. He was popular because he was the paymaster. So once a month, these colourful characters would come before him saying, "Hey, John Dickens, I've been around the world. I've sailed to Bora Bora. I've seen monkeys with coconuts. And now I'm here on shore leave. Can we pay?" And my father John would come home and tell us these wild stories about these sailors and the interesting, colourful characters. And it was utterly fascinating. Now, my parents also liked to have parties, wonderful parties all the time. Now, that did not mean parties, of course, for the Dickens children. We were put to bed by our nanny, Miss Mary Weller. Now, Mary would tell us children's stories, as so many nannies do, so that we would go to sleep. Only Mary's stories were about ghouls, goblins, and banshees, and things that went bump in the night. Quite interesting. This love of storytelling was passed down, though, and it stuck with me as I went on into life and got my first job writing down transcriptions in Doctor's Commons. And then I got my first journalism job, which led to my first writing job, which is writing these short sketches of life called Sketches by Boz. That, in turn, led to my first novel, The Pickwick Papers, which followed the adventures of Samuel Pickwick, Esquire, and his roving band of Pickwickians. Now, Samuel Pickwick had this manservant named Sam Weller, who loved to be a storyteller. It's a bit off, I believe. When Samuel met Samuel, Sam Pickwick said, "Ah, Sam Weller, huh? I believe you're a wag, aren't you?" To which Sam Weller said, "A wag? No, sir. Oh, don't call me that. My brother was called a wag and we shared a room. I think it might be catching." But the Pickwick Papers proved immensely popular, and by the time publication stopped, over 10,000 Londoners were paying every month to see what happened with their misadventures throughout all the country. Now, this gave me the impetus to quit my job transcribing and also to get married. Now, you might say to yourself, "Mr. Dickens, you've written a very funny book. We've read it. You should write more funny books." I would say, you would be wrong. For how could I write of merriment in the country when I was seeing all around me misery in the city? I saw the effects of the Poor Law of 1832, where Parliament had devised a scheme to perfect what was happening in England since the reign of Henry VIII, where now the working poor were catalogued and carted off to these poor law bastilles called union workhouses, where, since they could not establish residency for longer than 12 months because they'd be ushered along, they were forced into labour in these union workhouses. But for some it was worse, far worse than this. The children, orphans, for which there was no solicitor willing to stand up, no patron to stand up for them, were being sold into slavery before our very eyes. That's where I got the impetus for my second book, Oliver Twist. You might remember a very famous scene that I wrote where Mr. Bumble is standing in front of this sign in gigantic Roman numerals. He takes his cane and he raps 3 times upon the sign saying, who will take a boy? Who will take you, Mr. Salisbury? Yes, a boy. Who is it now? A productive apprentice. A millstone around the neck of us. Yes, liberal terms, Mr. Salisbury. You can buy a boy. Free labour. £5, Mr. Salisbury. Yes, it seemed that these giant captains of industry were not content to have these Paula Bastilles factor for them. No, why keep this form of indentured servitude on English soils when they could take it to India to make the tea for the hallowed afternoon break, or to the Caribbean to make rum for the gentleman's hour? Or why keep it there when you can take it to India to enslave an entire subcontinent? Or why not take it to South Africa, where you can mine the diamonds for the Regency ball for the ladies' necks and ears? No, ladies and gentlemen, why keep it with adults when you can have the stench of child labour right down the street from Buckingham Palace? Yes, indeed. The largest of empires never has the sun set upon it, but they are built upon the smallest backs. Now, I shall say there was a time when I thought the grass was greener, and so in 1832, my wife Kate and I, 1842, I'm sorry, we journeyed to America to meet some of our American friends. It was there that we met the American author Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Poe was quite an interesting character. You see, he came into our room in Baltimore. He looked rather haggard. He said, "Mr. Dickens, I brought you a present." "Yes, I have, sir." And he thrust something at me and I recoiled. I could see that it was flat, so I was not afraid for my life quite so much. And I took the gift and I smiled, and Mr. Poe smiled and backed out of the room. And thankful for my life, I was curious what this gift was. It was a book, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. So in the 6-week sailing from America back to England, I read this Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. You know what I found? I found they were a masterpiece. So you could say that, moved by the spirits, I wrote of the spirits. For when I got home in 1843, I wrote A Christmas Carol, a tale of Ebenezer Scrooge and visitation by 4 ghosts, not 3. I know you're thinking of 3, but do not sleep on Jacob Marley. For I tell you truly that if your friend who has been dead 7 years comes to visit you, and he takes his kerchief from around his head off, and his jaw falls down upon his breast, and you can see through his front into the back of his shirt tails and coat, he is most certainly a ghost. Now, these tales were so vivid to me that I endeavored to find Poe an English publisher, because copyright was something that was not followed at that time. But unfortunately, Poe had died in the interim before I could find an English publisher. He died a victim of his own addictions. I paid for his funeral that his death might have some dignity that his life had lacked. Now, contrary to the very popular in public saying, you can indeed go home again, and there I was back in England again. But you see, there's a certain principle of physics that you might be acquainted with, that what goes up must indeed come down. And this is what was happening in England. You see, we're in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, and if you take Manchester, for instance, which is the seat of the Industrial Revolution in England, there are factories lining the skyline into the horizon, with factories belching soot day and night, and what goes up must indeed come down. And whereas once there were fashions, greens, golds, blues, reds, every color in God's creation for fashion, now there were shades of grey and black to hide the soot that was falling on people's heads. Birds and moths, which had once been colourful, birding books were replete with illustrations of all these birds. Now they too are growing to shades of grey and black to hide from the predators. But it was worse Still, it was amazing because the artisans, which had once been in the country making gloves, shirts, hats, everything that you can imagine to wear, now being pulled into these cities, such as Manchester, to work at these factories which they could not compete with as far as pricing and rapidity of the wares that they were producing. This became the genesis for my book, Hard Times, wherein there's a portion where Stephen, who is a factory foreman, goes before Mr. Boundary, the factory owner, and an MP, a Minister of Parliament, these politicians which never seem to have the right answers or any answers at all, except the luncheons which they go to and vote upon things which are inconsequential to us on the streets. Stephen is there, pleading his case, pouring his heart out, and he is brushed aside by everyone in power because it's not profitable to listen to him. Yes, indeed. This, ladies and gentlemen, could indeed be seen as the genesis for one of my most famous characters. For if you look deep into it, you'll see that there's a very famous character. Yes, he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, wrenching, clutching, covetous old sinner. No warmth could warm him, and no wintry cold could chill him. Yes, Ebenezer Scrooge. Perhaps it'd be seen as the world's worst boss that no one would ever want to work for. But really, what is in a name? Ebenezer Scrooge. Did Scrooge really stay the way he was through all of these situations? His lambasting of his nephew, his poor treatment of this poor businessman that were just looking to form a society of those to give some warmth and food to those who did not have anything at Christmas time. No, I seem to remember that the end of the book goes something like this. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he became as good a friend, a father, and a man as the good old city knew. So what is in a name? Ebenezer means a reminder of God's presence and help. Yes, those four ghosts I spoke of before, Scrooge did listen to them. He heard in his heart and in his soul what he needed to do. And this is where I plead with you, ladies and gentlemen, that you should know what to do when you hear that call in your heart and your soul. Christmas Carol is in its very essence a story of redemption. It's a story of turning over a leaf that's never too old, never too late for you to see that those around you are just those going towards a common end all the same, no matter who we think we are, no matter who we think the other person may be. This is the essence of what I wish to tell you today, and I thank you very much for listening to me.